What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. We have finally made it to our last unit of the year. So we've got a few videos left. That's it before we start AP review. We've gone over hundreds of names, hundreds of psychology vocab terms. You've watched over 50 videos. It's been a long year. We've covered a lot of information, and hopefully you've learned a lot. So this is the final wrap up to it all before we start review, and that is social psychology. Okay, so we're going to start with social thinking. Social psychology is similar to a class maybe some of you have taken with sociology. However, in sociology, it's the study of people in groups and how those groups interact and relate to one another. Where in psychology, we're still very heavily focused on the individual and their own individual thoughts and beliefs and how that leads them to interact with and think about society as a whole. Okay, so we're going to start with social psychology overall. Is the scientific study of how we think about, influence, and relate to one another. Okay, so there's a big emphasis in social psych on social cognition. And whenever you hear the term cognition, you think thought, right? And social thought, or the mental process that's associated with the ways in which people perceive and react to others. So it's the way we see other people, the way we react to other people, the way we think about other people. So through social cognition, each person creates a unique perception of reality. Right? We all have a different sense of reality. And we touched on that with sensation and perception, how people could be taking in the same thing, but perceive it completely differently. And it's the same thing in social psych, right? You could be in the same situations, interacting with similar people, and have totally different perspectives or perceptions of what is happening in those situations based on your own individual thoughts and beliefs. So a big piece of social psych is attribution theory. Okay, so I want you to think about the word attribution and what that means. It's the process of explaining the causes of people's behavior, including your own. Okay? So in this instance, we're talking about our behavior and other people's behavior and why it's happening. So there's two ways that you can attribute, two things you can attribute to someone's behavior. You can do an external attribution. You can external factors, the situation is impacting their behavior, or you can attribute it to their internal disposition, or their personality and their personality traits, and that's who they are as a person, and that's why they're behaving that way. Okay. So here's an example to help understand attribution theory a little bit. So imagine you're driving, right? We've all been there. Driving on the highway, you're going down, all of a sudden, from up on your right side, car zooms by, cuts over in front of you, and starts weaving through traffic, right? You have to slam on your brakes because they cut you off so quickly. What's going to come out of your mouth at that time? Maybe if you do inappropriate things, you're going to get upset, your blood pressure is going to rise, maybe you're going to call them a jerk and say, what the heck, right? And you are probably going to attribute their terrible driving to them being a jerk or an a-hole, right? And so you're making an internal disposition about their personality. Okay? Whereas, who knows, maybe there was some type of unanticipated emergency, like an external situation. They needed to get to the hospital. They're in labor. Their wife's in labor, something like that. Oftentimes, we attribute other people's behavior to their internal disposition, and we discount the potential external factors that could be leading to their behaviors. So that's attribution theory, a little bit about that. One key part of attribution theory is fundamental attribution error, which I just touched on a little bit with that example. So it's our tendency to over-attribute the behavior of others to internal factors, such as their personal disposition, their personality traits. Right? So when it comes to our own behavior, we are much more aware and sensitive to how our behavior changes within different situations that we encounter, rather than our personality traits alone. Okay? So fundamental attribution error, we assume other people's behavior is due to their internal personality, like that person cutting you off. He's just a jerk. He's an a-hole. He doesn't care about other people, right? Whereas in reality, there may be a situation that's causing that. Okay. So on the flip side of fundamental attribution error is self-serving bias. So this is our tendency to attribute our success, your own success, to internal factors, such as your personality, right? And your beliefs. And your failures, you attribute those to external factors. So this often comes into play when you commit the fundamental attribution error and you assume something negative about another person while giving yourself the benefit of the doubt. That is self-serving bias. Okay, so here's another example for you. Let's say you get an A on a test, right? In psych class, you crush it, you get an A. You're like, why did you get that A? It's like, I put in the hard work. I'm a hard worker. I always, I study because I value my grades and I value psychology, right? You're giving yourself that internal attribution. Or let's say you go to calculus, or maybe it's psych again, and you get an F on the next test. And then you say, oh, it's due to how hard the test was. Well, there's a bunch of questions that we didn't learn about, right? I hear that all the time from students, in other AP classes that have huge amounts of information to cover, or how unfair and unreasonable the teacher is, how hot or cold the room was, your pencil was too short, your shirt was itchy that day, all of these different things. When we do poorly, we tend to attribute it to the situation. Whereas when we do well, we attribute it to our internal disposition, our personality. That's the self-serving bias. And we do the opposite for other people, which is the fundamental attribution error. Okay? So our attitudes are a large part of social psych in our attribution theory. Our attitudes are beliefs and feelings that predispose our reaction to objects, people, and events. So to put that simply, it's how we feel about something, how we feel about people, how we feel about things, how we feel about different things that happen in life. It's our feelings, our attitudes. So social psychologists believe that attitudes are made up of three components. A cognitive piece. This is our beliefs about the attributes of an object. Okay? Our beliefs about other people, our beliefs about objects and events. Affective is our feelings about the object, right? What we believe, how we actually feel about it, that person, how we feel about that event or that object. And then the behavior is how we act, how we then act towards it. How do we act towards that person based off of our beliefs and feelings? How do we act towards that object based on our beliefs and feelings? Okay. So a simple example, if someone's nice to you, you feel kindly towards them and you act in a friendly manner, right? Someone's nice to you, you believe that they're a nice person, you feel good about them, so you act in a friendly manner towards them, right? Our cognitive, affective, and behavioral parts of our attitude. So within our attitude, there's a few ways that your attitudes can be changed, and there's a few ways that our attitudes influence then our behaviors. Okay? And these are persuasion roots. These are vocab terms we need to cover. And it's also good to understand how people are persuaded and how their ideas change. So attitudes change through the central route of persuasion, or the direct persuasion, when someone who's interested in a topic focuses on the scientific evidence and arguments, and they respond with favorable thoughts. So this would be, let's say you're looking for a credit card for the first time, and you do all the background research. You look at the reviews, you look at the features, you look at all of these different things that could benefit you, and you respond with the one that makes the most sense based on all of those factual pieces of evidence, right? Or if you're trying to buy a new car, for example, you look at the cars with the best engine, the best gas mileage, the best safety ratings, and you buy the car based on those pieces of facts. That's the central direct route of persuasion. On the flip side, you have peripheral, or the indirect route of persuasion. And this is when you think of, on your favorite podcasts, your favorite TV shows, those actors and those people, when they are making pitches and trying to sell you something. This is when attitudes change, when people are making snap judgments based on incidental cues, like the attractiveness of the speaker or how much you enjoy that person. So this would be why you see celebrities and athletes and things in endorsement ads on Instagram or endorsement ads on TV, things like that. So instead of buying the car because of all of its important attributes that make it the best car, you buy it because somebody you love or somebody you look up to is endorsing it. Your favorite podcaster, your favorite TikToker, your favorite athlete has endorsed this product, so you buy it, right? That's the peripheral route of persuasion. So those attitudes that we have towards these different things can change our actions. So attitudes will also influence our actions if a couple things happen. One, if outside influences on what we say and do are minimal. So if there's little peer pressure or little pressure from your parents, things like that, then you're generally going to follow your attitudes as long as there's not too much outside pressure. You're going to do what you believe. Two, the attitude is specifically relevant to the behavior. Okay? The more specific the attitude is to the action, the more likely the two are to be in harmony. Okay? So for example, your attitudes about running a mile a day as a good form of exercise will predict whether you're going to run when you're exercising, right? Okay. The attitude is specifically relevant to the behavior. Do you have an attitude on running? okay, then maybe you're more likely to or less likely to do it when you're exercising. 3, we are keenly aware of our attitudes. So the more that you know yourself and know your own internal beliefs, you're more true to yourself. So that's when we talk about reflection and thinking about your thinking and things like that, metacognition. When we know and are conscious of what we believe, we are more true to ourselves. Knowing yourself. That goes all the way back to the identity versus role confusion stage that most of you are in right now, from Erickson's stages of development, trying to find yourself and understand your own beliefs to help you be true to yourself. Okay, so attitudes will follow behaviors in a couple instances. So we just talked about how attitudes can influence our behavior or our action. Well, sometimes our behaviors can influence our attitudes. Okay, so they flip-flop a little bit, but let's see what some examples of that are. So there's something called foot in the door phenomenon. This is what a lot of salesmen use to increase their sales, but it's the tendency for people who agree to a small request to comply with a larger one. Okay, so to get people to agree to something big, you start small and you build up from there. Okay, one good example, which is a tough example of this, is what Hitler did in Germany. He didn't begin his plan of exterminating all Jewish people by just straight up killing them right away, right? He started small, having them register, having them rounded up into ghettos, then having them taken into concentration camps and things like that. And he worked his way up to the point he was trying to get with the foot in the door phenomenon. Why does this work? People find it hard to say no when they have already agreed to a few smaller steps. Right? So have you ever had that situation where you get into something and you're like, well, we're too far in now to stop. I guess we might as well finish, right? That's the same idea. Well, I've already bought a few pieces of this. I might as well buy the rest of it, right? Stanley Milgram did a huge experiment on this in his obedience study that we'll talk about, getting people to administer more and more severe shocks to other human beings because they'd already started and they were listening to authority, right? So getting in your foot in the door can allow you to squeeze through and eventually get your whole self through that door, right? Getting a small part and eventually getting a larger and larger piece. So another part of this would be the door in the face phenomenon. And this is kind of like the exact opposite of the foot in the door. Instead of asking for something small at first, you ask for a giant favor, right? One that you know is going to be denied, right? It's never going to happen. But once the person turns that down, they ask, or you ask, you agree, you say, yeah, that request was pretty ridiculous, right? So let's say you want to go on spring break with your friends. You ask your parents, you say, hey, my friends they're going to Italy for the summer and they invited me. Can I do that? And your parents are like, no, it's way too long. You're too young for that. Can't do that. You're like, okay, that was probably too big of an ask. Well, what if we just go down to Florida for a week together then? Is that okay? Since I'll be missing out on this big trip. And something that, that's really what you wanted in the first place. You knew that Italy trip was never going to happen, but you wanted to go on spring break instead. So because you appear willing to compromise and because the request seems modest in comparison with the huge one you asked first, it's more likely to be granted than if that was the one that you made at the outset, right? So we have foot in the door where you start small and you start to increase it, bigger and bigger asks, right? If you've ever seen that, the Netflix documentary on the Tinder swindler, it's kind of like that foot in the door phenomenon, right? And then you have door in the face where you ask for something huge and outrageous you're not going to get. So then you can drop down and compromise to what you really wanted in the first place. Okay. All right. So attitudes also follow behaviors in this instance. Something you may have heard of before called cognitive dissonance theory. Okay? And this is when people become aware of the inconsistencies or the dissonance or the disconnect between their attitudes and behaviors. You can also think of this as hypocrisy, or someone who starts to feel hypocritical. That's causing or should cause cognitive dissonance. They become anxious and they're motivated to make their thoughts and behaviors consistent. Okay? The psychologist who's associated with this, developing this theory, you're going to want to write this down, was Leon Festinger. So here's an example of cognitive dissonance for you. Someone believes that smoking is unhealthy, but they also acknowledge that they smoke, right? They're a smoker and they know smoking's unhealthy. So their attitudes and behaviors aren't meshing. There's a disconnect or a dissonance there that's causing anxiety. So they would have to be motivated to reduce that dissonance in their actions and beliefs. Now, what happens? Well, behavior is difficult to change, right? Behavior is, you have routines, you're set in your ways. It's hard to change your behavior. So people tend to reduce their dissonance by changing their attitudes. So unfortunately, instead of changing their behavior, they change their attitudes. So this person's going to say, well, smoking's not actually that unhealthy, really, if you look at these factors, and they're going to try to change their attitude so they don't have to change their behavior. That's cognitive dissonance, right? There's a disconnect between your attitudes and your behavior, or your thoughts and beliefs and your behaviors or your actions. All right, so to wrap this up, another major example of how attitudes follow behaviors is this Stanford prison experiment with Philip Zimbardo, who's still a practicing psychologist, a really big name in the field. Write this down. We're going to talk about it in class also. But he had his famous Stanford prison experiment where he assigned roles, and it showed that role playing affects attitudes and behaviors, right? And these college students were randomly assigned to the roles of prisoners or guards for the scheduled 2-week experiment that only lasted 6 days because the situation devolved so rapidly into the guards being abusive and the prisoners rioting and trying to push back. And all of this just devolved so fast that it showed the impact that roles have on our attitudes and our behaviors. Right? So it's a big experiment we'll touch on, and we'll discuss more in class to show you the impact that it had. Obviously, when we see it, it's very unethical, but it's a seminal study in psychology, one that's very important to note, kind of like Stanley Milgram's obedience study, which we'll also cover as well. So this wraps up our social thinking intro and the way that we attribute behavior and things to different people and to ourselves, and how that impacts our role in society. So we'll touch on some more of this in class. As usual, let me know if you have any questions.